Okay, thanks. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about an exciting program that we have going called the Eastern Maine Coastal Current. It's an effort to build a regional network that supports the research framework for ecosystem-based fisheries management in our part of the state of Maine. We come from the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, a small nonprofit based right on the harbor in Stonington, Maine. You can see an image up there of Stonington if you've not been there. We're on the eastern edge of Penobscot Bay and very much a working waterfront. The largest lobster landing port in the state is right there, quite possibly the world. Our mission is simply to secure a sustainable future for fisheries and fishing communities in Eastern Maine and beyond. Our tagline is to fish forever, which has a couple of purposes. One being we would like to be able to fish forever, but then we're also a conservation organization interested in making sure there are fish forever. Before we dive into some of the thinking that we have about where we want to go with ecosystem-based fisheries management, I'll just a few words about fisheries management in general as it's evolved over several decades. And certainly it has an intent of conservation and management, and of course hopes to allow for some level of fishing. We think fisheries management needs to continue to evolve. And so whereas at present, for the most part, fisheries are managed on an individual species by species for the targeted species that you're familiar with, whether that be lobster themselves or the groundfish. We tend to assess the population as best we can. It's difficult to do with fish because you don't see them, they're under the water. So there are different tools for monitoring and measuring and counting fish, and then modeling those populations and trying to determine how much can we catch in a sustainable way. So terminology like allowable catch limits, total allowable catches, things like that come into play for managing many of the fisheries. And then of course there's access to the fisheries and who gets to fish. How do we allocate that quota? How do we allocate the licensing and permits that allow people to either enter the fishery or stay in the fishery? And many fisheries are closed and it's difficult to get into fisheries. There's also other conservation tools, including closing areas at certain times of the year, perhaps critical habitat areas, rotating some of those closed areas based on the fishing activity in the area is common with some species. And then some species have a season, a very clear season. Scallop fishery, for example, in Maine opens up in early December and finishes up around now as the fishing commences. So our questions about this traditional way of managing fisheries include how does scale and where we're fishing matter? How does the ecosystem fit into this approach? How do the different animals relate to one another? We're also very interested in how the local knowledge combined with traditional science can inform future management. Maybe a more holistic and collaborative approach is possible, including fishermen and community leaders in helping to determine how fisheries are going to be prosecuted in their area. And that bumps into, of course, social factors, social and economic factors related to markets and workforce. So how does all this fit together? Well, it's a classic conundrum problem. Here's a picture of Stonington, complex fishing area, working waterfront, lots of different social norms and habits and heritage, but also new and emerging opportunities. And we're keenly interested in how a town like this and many others are adapting to and seeing how change is affecting them every day and into the future. So essentially our work is embedded in the whole notion of creating resilient communities. If we were to simplify this down to a problem statement, it might be that the long-term sustainability and resilience of our coastal fishing communities depends on a diversification of product opportunities that are co-managed in an ecosystem-based manner. And I'm gonna hopefully describe for you how the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries is working on this. So in a real simple sense, if we just take a critter and think about the lobster, for example, and how it lives in its ecosystem, this is the life cycle of a typical crustacean like a lobster. And there are different ecosystem elements that affect its well-being and how it breathes and how it relates to its food web and the physiology of its health related to temperature, and certainly its access to food through its own life cycle. And as it grows and becomes a fishery, becomes a target organism. And so you lay on that natural system that lobsters have, you put on there the human part of that, and the fact that we're going to take some of them out of the fishery and consume them through the lobster fishery. We also, this fishery bumps into the herring fishery, which is one of the many popular, the most popular form of bait for the fishery. And so that's a completely different managed species, but we're contributing that food biomass into the system through these traps, and that relates and then helps to contribute to the biomass of the lobster. And then we take these out, we put them into the marketplace. And so there's a social dependence of our communities on this fishery. And all of these factors ebb and flow, come and go, and they cause stress and strain, and should be considered in total when we're thinking about how to manage the lobster fishery in this case. And then you put a hugely charismatic and endangered species on top of this. The North Atlantic right whale, as many of you may know, is endangered in this area, and it's causing conserving the right whale is triggering a whole bunch of other stressors and contemplation on how can we minimize the risk of the lobster fishery to the survival of this species. So it's complicated when you start thinking about all the interrelationships here. So an ecosystem-based fisheries management approach, there's tons of definitions of this, but we like this one from NOAA. And in fact, highlighted in red here, the geographically specified area is an important piece of our work and how we're going about exploring EBFM. And a recognition that it's the physical, biological, economic, and social interactions that really matter to the fisheries. It's not just about fish. It's how do those fish and the activity of fishing fit into the human elements of the ecosystem. So therein comes our idea, and it was codified and signed and through a cooperative research and development agreement with both the federal and state marine resource agencies, so NOAA and Maine DMR, both science organizations as well as regulators, signed a CRADA agreement back in 2019 with Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. And through this partnership, we developed the Eastern Maine Coastal Current Collaborative that we want to tell you a bit more about. It's defined by place, as mentioned earlier in the definition. So the Eastern Maine Coastal Current, you can see from this simple sketch of the oceanography of the Gulf of Maine. We believe that as water comes off the Labrador Current in the North Atlantic, it rolls into the Gulf of Maine off of Nova Scotia, and it ends up rolling along the eastern coast of Maine, and tends to gyre off midway down the coast at Penobscot Bay. And this is a feature that's been defined by oceanographers. And so we have this biogeographic feature called the Eastern Maine Coastal Current that pretty much defines this area of Eastern Maine, which includes Hancock and Washington counties. Our objective on this project is to develop a research framework that supports ecosystem-based fisheries management in this region. And we're following some traditional methodologies, this stolen from a paper by Levin that talks about the stages of work that we have to do to develop a regional ecosystem plan. And of course, we want to figure out how local knowledge and science is going to inform this. And so you can see in this cycle, there are different stages of understanding what we know, and what we know are gaps, steps that we have to take to fill in those gaps and engage people around what EBFM is, develop a plan, implement that plan, presumably through new science and monitoring and modeling, and learn more as we recircle and go through this. So the EM3C has evolved over the last few years, and we're moving our way around this process of engagement, and we stumbled a little bit with the COVID pandemic, and we'll tell you a bit about that. But we started this out back in 2019 with a 2-day conference in Machias at the University of Maine up there, and had a really great gathering of well over 150 people. Perhaps some of you attended that, and we did both plenary and breakout work over 2 days and really drilled into some of these questions around ecosystem management. We had plenary speakers that are listed here: Ed Bassett from the Passamaquoddy Tribe, Cora Johnson from the University of Maine at Machias, John Kosick from the NOAA Fisheries Science Center office in Orono, and Tom Huntington from the USGS. And so they helped to, kind of set the stage for breakout conversations that ended up going into this kind of an approach where we looked at the ecosystem in Eastern Maine from these 4 ecological compartments. So the upland, what goes on upland in the rivers and the communities, perhaps far from the coast in some cases. How do those watersheds then contribute to the coast through the intertidal zones, and then what we would call the nearshore, perhaps state level fisheries, and then even offshore, and how do different elements of oceanography in the deep waters relate? And of course, in each of these 4 components, you have both natural system nuances and you have social system nuances. We continued after the conference with an engagement plan that began back in 2020 to drill into some of these watershed areas and really get local communities talking and thinking about what their ecosystem means and what their communities want to understand as they explore future innovations in management. So we picked these 4 areas that are listed here and indicated by the blue dots on the map. And our plan was to go through these communities and have local voices really contribute to the discussion around some specific themes through a method that we've employed before at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, and then take those findings out to the science community and do a second round with scientists, researchers, policymakers, and so forth, and begin to build a network that is learning from local values. So those local questions, we tease them into 3 basic bins and do this World Cafe style, as you can see in this picture. It's participants sitting around a table and really scribbling and learning from one another and thinking together around these 3 themes. And then they rotate. So they chew on one of these for a set amount of time, 20 minutes perhaps. What is changing in the region that you see? What makes it change? Is it economic, social, or biological? Let people think on that. And then we move and rotate to another table, and they look at the second question: what is changing in the policy or the rules, the regulations around you? Are they good? Are they bad? And then the final part of the rotation is to think about what their community really wants for the future. What's important to them? What are their values? Where do they see things going in terms of their preferred future? So it's a fascinating thing to do. And we got 2 of these under our way in the Narraguagus River in Millbridge, and then in Trenton, we hosted a meeting and covered kind of the Union River, Frenchman Bay area. However, then, as you all know, COVID hit back in early 2020, and that interrupted that wave of work that we were doing. Some of the ideas and themes that emerged through this are just listed here. And you can see, if you just read these on your own, that some of them are very pragmatic observations. No more mussel seed. We don't see mussel seed. Some of them are social dimensions, to educate and develop the workforce skills for what is needed in our community. So real visionary kinds of thoughts. And then some folks really thinking about how research capacity needs to be enhanced, and how co-management, and that is sharing some of the responsibility for managing with local voices, is an important part of the future. So this is all fodder that we've gained over this time and put together into synthesizing kind of a baseline of where we want to go with this initiative, and understanding, build a network. Who are some of the important stakeholders to bring into that conversation? What do they bring with them for feelings and values around threats and concerns and challenges and options? From there, can we glean some of the gaps that we have, both scientifically and in terms of other knowledge? And how can we make sure these communities are learning from one another in their own place, but also thinking about this as a bioregion, and thinking about what are the right ways for us to move forward and communicate with them as we build either new resources or bring more of the research community into some of these important questions. I guess I should just mention quickly, since this is a sustainability conference, that I'm aware of the UN sustainability goals, many of you are, and we would see this kind of work touching on several of them perhaps, but these 2 in particular both conserving, sustaining, the oceans and the seas, number 14, in terms of marine resource and sustainable development, but also the cities, because we really believe that the resilient, sustainable communities is a huge part of how we have to manage both commercial fisheries, capture fisheries, aquaculture, and really a seafood economy. So the strategy of linking the natural and social systems together, we're following a framework, Eleanor Ostrom's popular framework for social ecologic systems. And as we kind of superimpose that, that wheel of elements on this area, you can see that I've got a photo there of an ecosystem, kind of a watershed level look of the resource system. You come down to the left, then you have a resource unit, and perhaps that's one or more of the species that are living in that system that we're interacting with, both in terms of harvesting and trying to sustain their populations. And the fishermen off to the bottom right is the user group, of course. And then the governance that fits around this has all kinds of different layers, both federal and state, and even more local levels of governance. As we look at the social ecologic system through this kind of a framework, it's obvious that it's the interactions between these four elements that are so important. How do fishermen interact with the ecosystem? We know how they interact with their units, and then importantly, how can the governance system understand more than just the critter it's trying to manage, but really managing the whole system and the populations. And of course, this cycle it's not happening in a vacuum. It's got external stressors to it, both social and economic, political settings that are alluded to here in this graphic, as well as some of the related ecosystem elements that are outside of our control. And they might include, climate change factors that we're all aware of, whether it's sea level change or, increased storm activity. So watersheds are behaving different. Temperature regime, we know, has been shifting to some degree in the Gulf of Maine, sometimes more severe than other times. We also know that we have this right whale issue I alluded to earlier with an Endangered Species Act and challenges associated with helping to conserve that whale. There's also new interest in ocean offshore wind energy in the Gulf of Maine. And a lot of the folks who work along the coast and fishermen who are fishing out in the Gulf of Maine are very concerned about what does that mean to them in terms of impacting on the fisheries. Places like Maine are undergoing demographic and sociologic change, much like anywhere else in the country. And that's been really nuanced recently by the COVID and people moving around a lot more. What does that do to the values and the social structure of these communities? And then our market forces. We saw an interesting set of challenges and trends that emerged through the COVID experience this last year in terms of seafood and seafood demand, and what are the opportunities for market forces. These are all very complex issues that many of us could spend our entire career exploring. I just want to bring to your attention one paper that you might find interesting. It's really a communique from Dr. John Hare. He's one of our partners from NOAA. He's the leader of the Northeast Fisheries Science Center out of Woods Hole, Massachusetts. And he published this document, I think it was in 2020. And for him, it's 10 lessons from the front lines of science and supportive fisheries management. And as John has gotten to know our work and think about this type of a pilot scale approach to social ecologic systems in fisheries management, it really informed him as we got him interacting with some of our fishermen. And so it's an interesting read if you can find it. It's only a handful of pages long from the ICES Journal of Marine Science. So what's next for us? We're continuing these conversations with our partners and fishermen. They are obviously distracted with some of the issues that you see listed here that I've already talked about, but it's still the similar conversation as what we had before, because it does bump into change, it bumps into policy and regulation, it bumps into values and what do they see for their future. We see an important opportunity for a nonprofit like ours to help our fishermen and communities to navigate these challenges and try to understand what they are before they become a crisis, and try to be resilient so that they can take control of their future and be prepared. Essentially, that's resilience. So thank you for listening. Carla and I will I'll stand by after the other presentations, I think, and be available to take some questions.